The neighbors called it a waste of good money and a sign of a man who'd lost his grip on reality. That's what they said. Not to his face, because most of them didn't have the nerve for that. But in the parking lot of the Feed and Seed, over coffee at Marion's Diner, in the bleachers at the Friday night games, they said Holt Deacon had finally gone around the bend, and that whatever the army had done to him over there had come home with him and taken up permanent residence. Holt heard it anyway. Small towns in eastern Kentucky don't keep secrets very well. He didn't say much in response. He never had been a man of many words, even before the service, and 31 years in the U.S. Army. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, and a final posting at Fort Campbell that ended with a medical discharge and a handshake had not made him more talkative. He'd come back to Decker's Creek because it was the only place left that still felt like his, and he'd bought his grandfather's old property on the ridge above town because the house down in the valley had been sold when his wife left. And anyway, he preferred the elevation. The ridge property had a cabin on it, 2 rooms, a loft, a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in 20 years. The roof needed replacing. The well needed drilling. The generator needed everything. Holt spent the first summer fixing what was broken, and the second summer adding what wasn't there. That was when the talk started. He poured a concrete footer and built a secondary structure behind the cabin. Not large, maybe the size of a 2-car garage, half buried in the hillside. He ran a second propane line and installed a wood gasification system that his neighbor 2 ridges over, a retired engineer named Stoker, helped him wire. He put in a hand pump for the well, and a gravity-fed water tank he'd fabricated himself from galvanized steel. He ran a root cellar beneath the secondary structure, lined it with shelving, and began filling it the way his grandmother had filled hers. Systematically, methodically, without apology. He also acquired a dog. The dog came from the county shelter in Hazard, where it had been surrendered twice, and overlooked approximately 40 times by people who wanted something smaller or younger or less obviously complicated. It was a Belgian Malinois mix, somewhere between 3 and 5 years old, depending on which vet you asked, with a scar across its left shoulder that no one could satisfactorily explain, and eyes that were the color of Winter Creek water. The shelter staff had named it Bolt because it had a habit of going very still and then moving extremely fast, which Holt thought was a reasonable name but not quite right. He called it Creek after the town, and after about a week it stopped looking at him with suspicion and started sleeping across the doorway of whatever room he was in. The people of Decker's Creek found the whole project puzzling, and then, gradually, irritating. There was something about Holt's preparations that seemed to make them uncomfortable in a way they couldn't name. So they named it something else. They called it paranoia. They called it a bunker mentality. A woman named Phyllis, who ran the styling salon on Main and served as the town's primary communication infrastructure, once said within earshot of Marion's cook that Holt Deacon was building himself an ark and that it was the saddest thing she'd ever seen. A man alone on a hill waiting for a flood that wasn't coming. Her son-in-law, a big man named Tate, who did excavating work and had twice turned down Holt's request for a quote on a drainage project, said something less charitable at the 4th of July picnic. Holt was not there to hear it, but 3 people who were told him about it the following week, which was Decker's Creek's way of being friendly. What Tate said was, "Man like that's got a screw loose. What's he think is coming, the end of the world?" There was laughter. That was in the summer, when the valleys were green and the idea of disaster felt like a category of thing that happened somewhere else. That was in July. The flood came in February. It had been a wet winter, wetter than anyone could remember, though several of the older residents, Holt's age and older, said they remembered 1978, and said this felt similar. Said they'd been telling people all fall that the ground was saturated and the river was running too fast. Nobody had listened particularly hard. There was no flood wall in Decker's Creek. The county had been discussing one since 2009, but the funding had been redirected 3 times, and the project had never made it past the planning stage. The river, a tributary of the Cumberland, called Decker's Branch by locals, and a few outdated maps, ran through the center of town behind the old hardware store, and in normal years it was easy to forget it was there. February 14th brought 2 days of rain on top of frozen ground, on top of a winter's worth of snowmelt. The branch came up 6 inches in the first night, then a foot. By the morning of the 15th, the water was in the street behind the hardware store. By noon, it was across Maine. The power went at 2:17 in the afternoon, when a transformer blew somewhere upstream. Holt was on the ridge when it went. He saw the town go dark. He could see the valley from his porch, which was part of why he'd wanted the elevation. And he stood there for a moment with Creek beside him, watching the brown water spreading through the low streets below. And then he went inside and began filling every container he had with clean water, because he knew from experience that even systems that survived floods often had their water compromised for days afterward. Creek watched him from the doorway. "I know," Holt said. "Let's go." He loaded the truck, an older model F-250 he'd kept in running condition, specifically because it was high clearance and carbureted, no complicated electronics to fail, and drove down the ridge road with Creek in the passenger seat. The road flooded at the base of the hill, about a quarter mile from the first houses. Holt parked on high ground and waded in from there, the water cold enough to feel like a wound. Creek swimming beside him without complaint. The first house he reached was the Pettigrew place, where an older woman named Coral lived alone since her husband passed. She was standing on her porch with water at the bottom step, holding a flashlight and looking confused in the way people look when the world has departed from its expected behavior. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Holt said. "Holt Deacon," she said. "Lord boy, what are you doing out in this?" "Coming to get you," he said. "Come on." He carried her on his back to the truck. She weighed maybe 100 pounds. She did not argue. The next house was the Albury family. 2 parents and 3 children. The youngest maybe 4 years old, and they waded out together, the father carrying the small one, the older children in a chain with Holt at the front. Creek swam back and forth in a pattern that looked random but wasn't, keeping track of each child in a way that Holt had not trained him for and could not have explained. The Albury children thought Creek was the greatest thing they'd ever seen. Even waist-deep in floodwater, they were trying to pet him. After the Alburys came the block on Sycamore Street, where 4 households of varying ages were stranded, and then a family named Quinlan, whose basement had already filled and whose first floor was going fast, and then an elderly man named Burl, who refused to leave for 20 minutes, and then finally carried the same way as Coral Pettigrew, though he was heavier and had considerably more opinions about the indignity of the situation. He also kept apologizing. "I know what I said about your place," Burl told Holt halfway through the water. "Said you were a fool. Said it more than once." "Don't worry about it," Holt said. "I'm worrying about it." "Well," Holt said, "you can worry about it on dry ground just as well. Save your energy." He brought them up to the ridge in the truck. 3 trips, sometimes 4 people at a time. Creek in the bed or in the footwell, depending on how many people were in the cab. The cabin was not large, but Holt had planned for capacity, the way you plan for capacity when you've spent 3 decades thinking about what happens when things go wrong. He had cots and sleeping bags in the secondary structure. He had the root cellar full of food, canned goods, dried beans, rice, flour, honey, jerky, 5-gallon buckets of rolled oats, 200 pounds of potatoes he'd grown himself that past fall. He had a medical kit that could serve as a field station, because he had been a combat medic before he was anything else, and the supplies were what he reached for automatically when he thought about being prepared for something. He had the wood stove going by the time the second group arrived. He had water heating. He had lanterns lit in every room, and in the secondary structure, where the cots were being set up by Coral Pettigrew, who had apparently recovered from her shock and was now directing traffic with the quiet authority of a woman. who had organized church potlucks for 40 years. People filled the cabin, and then the secondary structure, and then the porch, which Holt had enclosed years ago, for reasons he couldn't fully remember. Decker's Creek had a population of about 600. Not all of them came to the ridge. Maybe 60 did. Those who couldn't get out on the main roads, those who had nowhere else dry to be, those who were brought by others. Once word spread that Holt Deacon had heat and food, and a way to keep going. Tate, the excavating contractor, who had said things about screws being loose, arrived near dark with his wife and mother-in-law. He knocked on the door of the secondary structure, which had become the main gathering place because it was the largest enclosed space. Holt opened it. Tate was a big man, and he had the look of someone who had decided something on the walk up the hill and was committed to it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I said things I shouldn't have." "Come inside," Holt said. "I'd like to say it first." "You can say it inside. You're letting the heat out." Tate came inside. His wife and mother-in-law followed. The mother-in-law, who was in her 70s and had thin white hair, and the look of someone who had survived several other things before this, sat down on the nearest cot and sighed deeply. "I've been on my feet since 8 o'clock this morning," she announced to the room in general. "There's soup," Coral Pettigrew told her. "Sit tight." Tate found Holt at the far end of the structure, filling cups from a thermos. "I said you'd lost your grip," Tate said. "I said it out loud in front of people." "I know," Holt said. "You still came and got people out." "I wasn't going to leave people in the water," Holt said. He handed Tate a cup of soup. "That's not how it works." Tate looked at the cup. He looked at the room full of people. Neighbors, some of them his customers, some of them his friends. All of them warm and fed, because this man he'd dismissed and mocked had spent 2 years building exactly what was needed for exactly this. "I don't know how you do that," Tate said. "Not take it personally." Holt thought about it. "I didn't build this to prove anything," he said. "I built it because I grew up here, and I know what this valley does in February. I built it because my grandmother nearly froze to death in this house in 1978. And nobody came for 3 days." He looked out the small window at the darkness and the rain. "You build what you need, that's all." Creek had been working the room since the second group arrived, moving from person to person, lying beside the ones who seemed most frightened, nudging the children when they got restless, settling beside the old ones when they fell asleep. Now he came and sat beside Holt with the businesslike certainty of an animal who has completed a task to his own satisfaction. Holt reached down and put his hand on Creek's head. "Good dog," he said quietly. It was not a dramatic thing. It didn't need to be. The water stayed high for 2 more days. The county emergency management office reached them on the evening of the second day by satellite phone. Holt had one of those, too, which had generated its own commentary when he'd bought it. And, by the morning of the third day, there were National Guard trucks on the main road and boats coming up from Hazard. By then, the ridge had become a small civilization. Coral Pettigrew had organized meal shifts and sleeping rotations. 3 of the adults with medical training, a retired nurse named Adele, a paramedic named Shaw who'd been stranded in town, and Holt himself, had established a corner for anyone who needed attention, and they'd treated a dozen minor injuries and kept a close watch on Burl, who had a heart condition and had been more shaken by the experience than he admitted. The children had, after initial anxiety, become enchanted by Creek and by the root cellar, and by the fact that this man they barely knew had a hand pump for water and a shelf of books and a coffee can full of dried herbs that smelled like medicine. Holt answered their questions patiently, which surprised some of the adults who had assumed he would be the kind of man who found children annoying. He was not that kind of man. On the afternoon of the second day, while most of the adults were talking or resting, he sat with 2 of the Albury kids, a boy named Sam and a girl named Lily who was maybe 10, and showed them how the hand pump worked and how you prime it, and what it means that water moves by gravity and pressure and not by magic or electricity. "What do you do if the pump breaks?" Lily asked. "You fix it," Holt said. What if you can't fix it? Then you have a backup. She considered this. Do you have a backup for everything? I try to, he said. Some things you can't back up. People, relationships. He paused. Mistakes. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this with the seriousness that children sometimes apply to things adults say without expecting them to. Is that why you live alone? She asked. Holt was quiet in return for a moment. Partly, he said. He did not say more, and she did not ask. And they sat there with the rain on the roof and creek stretched out between them like a draft stopper. And it was the kind of silence that is actually a form of company. By the time the guard trucks came and the rescue boats came, and the road was passable again, something had shifted in the valley below. Holt couldn't have named it exactly, but the people who came down off the ridge with him were not quite the same people who'd come up. Not changed in any dramatic way, not converted to some new philosophy, just adjusted, maybe, recalibrated. Burl walked out under his own power, which he was visibly proud of. He stopped at the base of the ridge road and turned around and looked up at the cabin, which you couldn't quite see from there because of the tree line, but which everyone knew was there. He built that thing himself. Burl said to no one in particular. Mostly, over 2 summers. No one responded, but everyone heard. Phyllis, who had said the thing about the ark, did not say anything on the way down. She had spent 2 nights in the secondary structure, and had eaten Holt's beans and rice, and had watched Creek work the room in the way he worked it, and she had arrived at some private conclusion that she kept to herself. When she passed Holt at the bottom of the hill, she stopped and took his hand in both of hers. Thank you, Holt, she said. Of course, he said. She nodded once, like something had been confirmed, and kept walking. Tate came last, with his wife and mother-in-law. He had helped Holt with the final check of the secondary structure, making sure the stove was banked properly. The generator was idled down. The food stores were covered and sealed. He'd worked without being asked, moving through the space with the practical intelligence of a man who worked with his hands for a living and understood systems even if he'd never built one like this. At the door, he stopped. If you ever need excavating work done, he said, I'll be over. I've got a drainage project, Holt said. Been waiting on a quote. Tate almost smiled. Yeah, he said. I know, I'll come by next week. He went down the hill. Holt stood on the porch and watched the last of them go. The valley below was a mess, mud and debris, and the waterline still visible on the sides of buildings, the brown tide mark that would be there for a year, maybe longer. The branch had already receded back to something close to its banks. The sun had come out that morning for the first time in 3 days, and was doing the thin, cautious work that February sun does in eastern Kentucky, providing light without much warmth. The world still gray and wet but no longer submerged. Creek sat beside Holt on the porch. They stayed like that for a while, the man and the dog, watching the valley settle back into itself. A chickadee landed on the porch rail and looked at them with the absolute confidence of a small animal that has survived many winters and expects to survive many more. Good instincts, Holt said to it. The chickadee did not respond. It flew away in the direction of the woodpile. Inside the cabin, the stove ticked with heat, and the shelves in the root cellar were lower than they had been 3 days ago, but not empty, not close to empty, because Holt had built for this, had planned for 60 people for 3 days, had done the math the way you learn to do math, when the consequences of being wrong are not abstract. He went back inside. He put water on the stove. He sat down at the table with his coffee and the stack of books he'd been working through since January. And Creek lay across the doorway in his usual position, which was the position of a dog who takes seriously his responsibility for knowing what comes through the door. Outside, the valley continued the slow work of recovery. Somewhere down on Main Street, a chainsaw started up, someone clearing debris from the road, beginning the unglamorous labor of putting things back to normal. There would be FEMA forms and insurance disputes, and arguments about the flood wall that had never been built. And some of it would resolve, and some of it wouldn't. And the town would go on the way towns go on. Up on the ridge, Holt Deacon drank his coffee and listened to the chainsaw, and thought about what he needed to rebuild, what he needed to restock, what came next. The drainage project. New potatoes in April. Maybe a second water tank on the south side of the secondary structure, if Tate's equipment could get close enough to the hillside. He opened his book. Creek's tail moved once, slowly, against the floorboards. The cabin on the ridge stood solid in the gray February light, the same as it had stood for 3 days of water, and 2 nights of 60 people, and 1 February, that nobody in Decker's Creek was going to forget for a long time. It had done exactly what it was built to do. It would be ready for the next time, because Holt Deacon had not built it because he was afraid. He had built it because he had seen enough of the world to know that the next time was not a question of whether but of when, and because when that time came, he intended to have a door that was open for whoever needed to come through it.